The first light of dawn crept across the gray waters of the English Channel. Cold waves slapped against the steel hulls of hundreds of landing craft, their engines humming beneath the roar of distant naval guns. The air was heavy with salt, exhaust, and fear. Inside one of the crafts, U.S. soldiers clutched their rifles as the metal ramp shuddered ahead of them. Above, on a flat-decked vessel, an M4 Sherman tank, its hull covered in waterproof canvas, lurched toward the surf. Its white star was barely visible beneath the grime and sea spray. On the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach, German officers watched through field glasses. They had seen these tanks before. Small, squat, undergunned machines that looked like toys beside their own Panthers and Tigers. They smirked. The Atlantic wall would swallow them whole. Then came the thunder. The Shermans churned forward through fire and foam, their 75mm guns spitting defiance. Bunkers that had mocked them minutes earlier began to vanish in smoke and flame. By mid-morning, the laughter had stopped. The toy tank had arrived and it wasn't playing anymore. To understand why the Germans mocked America's tanks, we must return to the uneasy years before the war, a time when the United States Army still trained with wooden dummies instead of real armor. In the late 1930s, Europe was already rearming. Germany's panzer divisions were parading across fields in Poland and France, their fast-moving columns redefining the concept of mechanized warfare. But across the Atlantic, the United States had not fought a major land war in decades. Its army was small, its doctrine outdated, and its armored forces barely existed. American officers debated endlessly over theory, how tanks should be used, how thick their armor should be, whether they should fight other tanks or support infantry. The lessons of World War I still lingered, slow-moving behemoths lumbering through mud choked by mechanical failures. Few believed tanks would ever replace the decisive power of artillery and infantry. Then came 1940. France collapsed in just 6 weeks. German panzers cut through Europe with terrifying speed. The world was stunned. Washington took notice. In the chaos of those months, one man began to see the future clearly. General George S. Patton, a cavalryman turned armored prophet. He believed that tanks were no longer the sideshow of war, but its cutting edge. Patton and other forward thinkers pushed the Army to modernize. They needed a new tank, one fast enough to keep up with mobile warfare, reliable enough to travel across continents, and simple enough to produce in vast numbers. In 1941, engineers at the Rock Island Arsenal and Detroit Tank Arsenal began designing what would become the M4 Sherman. The concept was revolutionary not because it aimed for perfection, but because it aimed for practicality. Where Germany built masterpieces like the Tiger and Panther, complex, powerful, but temperamental, the Americans chose balance. The Sherman was not the heaviest tank nor the most powerful, but it could be built by the thousands, repaired quickly, and transported across oceans. It was the machine of a nation built on factories, not fortresses. Its armor was sloped to deflect shells, its 75mm gun versatile against both infantry and light armor, and its engine, often a converted aircraft radial or a robust Ford V8, gave it remarkable reliability. Inside it was cramped and noisy, but it worked. And when it broke, it could be fixed in hours, not days. The Germans, upon learning of this medium tank, laughed. Their intelligence reports labeled it inferior. A mass-produced toy, some panzer officers scoffed. They measured war in millimeters of armor and caliber of guns, not in tons of fuel or days of uptime. But the Americans had a different metric. Numbers that could not be stopped. By 1942, the production lines were roaring. Ford, Chrysler, Fisher Body, and Press Steel Car Company were turning out tanks faster than any army in history. Where Germany might build 20 Panthers in a week, America could roll out 500 Shermans. It was not glamour, it was power. These machines first tasted combat in North Africa, under the command of inexperienced crews facing the battle-hardened Africa Corps. The Shermans were outgunned by the German 88mm cannons. Yet they kept coming, repaired, replaced, resupplied. What the Germans did not realize was that every destroyed Sherman taught its engineers a lesson. Every loss refined the next version. As 1943 approached, the M4 Sherman was evolving. Better guns, thicker armor, improved tactics. The United States had discovered not just a tank, but a system, an ecosystem of production, logistics, and battlefield adaptation. And while German tank designers chased perfection in blueprints, American factories prepared for something far greater, a war of endurance. The stage was set. Soon those toy tanks would face the pride of the Wehrmacht in the ultimate proving ground, the beaches and hedgerows of Normandy. By the winter of 1942, the M4 Sherman had become the backbone of America's armored forces. Its broad tracks rolled across the deserts of Tunisia and the rocky hills of Sicily, carrying a new generation of American tank crews into their first real battles against the German Panzer Corps. The first encounters were brutal. In North Africa, the Wehrmacht's Afrika Korps, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had already perfected the art of mobile warfare. German gunners used their 88mm cannons with surgical precision, striking from long range before the Shermans could close the distance. On the open sands, a Sherman could burn in seconds. Reports from the front were grim. Our shells bounce off their armor. Theirs tear through ours like paper. But what the Germans didn't see was what happened next. While Rommel's crews fought to keep their few precious tanks running, American logistics officers were unloading new Shermans at North African ports by the hundreds. Mechanics worked around the clock replacing lost vehicles in days. For every tank destroyed, 2 more rolled off the assembly lines back home. This was the first hint of a new kind of warfare. One not won by the thickness of steel but by the speed of production. The Germans called it wasteful. The Americans called it sustainability. By the time the fighting shifted to Sicily in mid-1943, the Sherman had already been upgraded. New models like the M4A2 and M4A3 carried improved armor and engines. Crews were learning to coordinate with infantry and air support, using combined arms tactics that turned each engagement into a team operation. The tank had evolved from an isolated brawler into the mobile core of Allied offensives. Meanwhile, in Europe, German designers were reacting. The encounters with the Sherman alarmed the Wehrmacht's technical departments. They rushed the development of heavier tanks, the Panther and the Tiger the One. These monsters boasted formidable 75mm and 88mm guns, thick frontal armor, and advanced optics. On paper, they outclassed the Sherman completely. But they came at a cost. Each German heavy tank took weeks to assemble, required specialized parts, and consumed enormous quantities of fuel. A resource Germany could no longer guarantee. The Tigers often broke down before even reaching the front. Panthers overheated, their transmissions failing in the first kilometers of movement. The Wehrmacht had built marvels of engineering, but not tools for a long war. In contrast, the Sherman was everywhere: Africa, Italy, the Pacific. By late 1943, over 10,000 had been produced. They could be shipped overseas, repaired with interchangeable parts, and operated by crews trained in just months. When American forces landed in Italy, the M4 became a symbol of momentum. It climbed steep mountain roads, forded rivers, and pressed through ruined villages. German soldiers facing them in the Italian campaign began to notice something unnerving. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, more appeared. The battlefield itself seemed to regenerate. By early 1944, Allied command was planning the greatest amphibious invasion in history, Operation Overlord. The Sherman would be its armored fist. To prepare, specialized variants were created. The DD duplex drive, amphibious Sherman, capable of swimming from landing craft to shore. The crab mine-clearing Sherman with rotating flails. The dozer variant equipped with blades to push obstacles aside. Each adaptation reflected American pragmatism: modify, simplify, deploy. German intelligence intercepted reports of these preparations and mocked them. One Panzer commander wrote in his diary, "The Americans think they can defeat the Tiger with numbers. They will drown themselves in their own mediocrity." But the laughter masked a growing anxiety. Behind those words, the Wehrmacht knew what its fuel depots, its factories, and its train yards were whispering. Germany could not match the flood. By June 1944, as Allied forces massed along the southern coast of England, nearly 50,000 Shermans stood ready. They were lined up on docks and warehouses, on ships, a steel tide waiting to cross the channel. The Germans still believed their armor superiority would crush any invasion. They trusted their panzers, their guns, their Atlantic wall. What they didn't yet understand was that Normandy would not be a contest of perfection. It would be a contest of endurance. And when the first Sherman tracks carved their way up the beaches of France, that contest began. In a war obsessed with innovation, the M4 Sherman succeeded not because it was the most advanced, but because it was the most rationally designed machine on the battlefield. Its creators never sought to outmatch the German Tiger gun for gun or armor for armor. Instead, they engineered a tank that embodied three principles: mobility, reliability, and standardization. The Sherman's heart was its engine, usually the Ford GAA, an 8-cylinder powerhouse adapted from aircraft technology. It could run for hundreds of miles with minimal maintenance, an advantage the Germans could only envy. Its transmission was simple enough for mechanics to repair in the field, and its components were interchangeable across variants. The M4's armor was sloped, an innovation borrowed from the Soviet T-34, allowing it to deflect shells that would have pierced flat plating. Its 75-meter gun was modest by late war standards, but versatile. It could destroy bunkers, anti-tank guns, and enemy infantry positions with high explosive shells, while still capable of damaging lighter German tanks. The Germans mocked this general-purpose approach. To them, each vehicle had a single role: the Tiger for domination, the Panther for precision, the Stu-G for defense. The Sherman, by contrast, was adaptable. It was not designed for a single battlefield. It was designed for every battlefield. Even its weaknesses became part of its strength. Its lighter armor meant it could cross bridges and muddy terrain where German behemoths could not. Its gun could be swapped for more powerful versions. The British, for instance, rearmed their Shermans with the high-velocity 17-pounder, creating the fearsome Firefly, a tank that could kill a Tiger from over 1,500 meters away. What seemed inferior was, in truth, flexible. The Sherman was a platform, not a monument. When a Tiger broke down, it required a factory crew to fix it. When a Sherman broke down, a field mechanic could get it running again before dawn. On the battlefield of Normandy, a maze of hedgerows, mud, and narrow lanes, reliability and versatility mattered more than brute strength. And that was where the M4 began to quietly outfight its critics. If the Sherman was a weapon, American industry was its trigger. By 1944, the United States was not just building tanks, and it was mass-producing war itself. In Detroit, the Chrysler tank arsenal became a city within a city, running 24 hours a day. Conveyor belts carried steel hulls beneath showers of sparks, while cranes lowered engines like organs into waiting bodies. At its peak, one new Sherman rolled off the line every 30 minutes. Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Pressed Steel Car Company joined in. Each followed the same blueprints, each producing interchangeable parts. This meant a damaged Sherman in Normandy could be repaired with components shipped from Michigan or Pennsylvania, parts that would fit perfectly, no matter where the tank had been built. In contrast, German factories worked in isolation. Each Tiger tank was almost hand-built, each component unique. A single damaged gearbox could take weeks to replace. The precision that made them formidable also made them fragile. The difference was philosophical. Germany built tanks like artisans. America built them like engineers. And behind those engineers stood an industrial army. Rosie the Riveter, welders, machinists, and factory managers who turned the American Midwest into an assembly line for victory. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, over 50,000 Shermans had been produced, with more on the way. It was a scale of output the Axis powers could neither match nor comprehend. German intelligence underestimated this completely. They believed tank warfare would remain a contest of quality. They did not foresee that America's greatest weapon would be its production line. A German Tiger might kill 3 or 4 Shermans in a fight, sometimes more. But for every Sherman lost, 3 new ones would arrive within days. For every Tiger destroyed, Germany lost months of precious manufacturing time. It was a war of arithmetic, and the numbers were merciless. When General Eisenhower reviewed the armored forces before D-Day, he understood the symbolism. The Sherman represented not just a tank, but a system. A seamless flow of fuel, steel, and manpower that could absorb losses and keep advancing. Every American tank crew entering Normandy carried not just their own machine, but the invisible might of thousands of factories behind them. And as they approached the beaches of France, that industrial heartbeat would soon collide with the German myth of mechanical invincibility. The balance was shifting, and from engineering perfection to logistical mastery, the next dimension of this story would no longer be about machines, but about the men inside them. The tank crews, commanders, and soldiers who turned cold steel into a living force. The human angle. The men inside the steel. Behind every Sherman tank was a crew of 5, a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. They were rarely veterans. Most were barely out of their teens, trained for a few months on mock ranges before being shipped to England. For many, the Sherman was their first real home in Europe, a steel box that could save their lives or end them in an instant. Inside, space was suffocating. The smell of oil, sweat, and cordite clung to every surface. The engine roared behind them like a living thing, drowning out their thoughts. When the gun fired, the entire hull shook and hot shell casings clattered to the floor. Yet the crews loved their tanks. They gave them names: Doris, Hell's Bell, Cindy Lou. They painted white stars and cartoons on the hulls, small acts of defiance against the fear that followed them. In Normandy, these crews faced horrors their training could never prepare them for. German Panzerfaust ambushes in the hedgerows, hidden 88mm guns waiting beyond every bend. One hit could ignite the Sherman's fuel and turn it into an inferno. The Germans called it a Ronson, lights up the first time every time. But the myth was exaggerated. By mid-1944, improvements in ammunition storage and armor reduced the fires, and the crews learned to adapt. They fought smarter, using cover, calling in air support, and coordinating with infantry. The Sherman's greatest weapon wasn't its gun, it was the men who refused to stop. Every destroyed tank became a rallying point for the next. Mechanics rebuilt, commanders reorganized, and crews climbed back in. The men who survived one fight were often back in another within days. Their courage turned the Sherman from a machine into a movement, relentless, enduring, and human. The leadership and tactical angle, mobility as doctrine. The Sherman's real genius was not just in its design, but in how American leadership chose to use it. Generals like George S. Patton, Omar Bradley, and Dwight Eisenhower understood that armor was not meant to duel endlessly with the enemy's best tanks. It was meant to move, to exploit gaps, to break the rhythm of the battlefield. Patton in particular believed that mobility was victory. A good plan violently executed now, he said, is better than a perfect plan executed next week. That philosophy was written into every Sherman advance. The German Tigers were tactical predators, deadly in ambush, fearsome on open ground. But they required careful logistics and perfect conditions. Patton turned the Sherman into a strategic weapon, one that could fight, refuel, repair, and fight again without waiting for ideal terrain or weather. American commanders emphasized coordination, armor with infantry, tanks with artillery, and close air support overhead. This combined arms system turned what seemed like a mechanical disadvantage into operational superiority. In the Normandy bocage, where every hedgerow was a fortress, tank commanders like Sergeant Lafayette Poole and Lieutenant Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter improvised under fire. They used bulldozer blades to breach earth walls, attached hedgerow cutters to the Shermans, and devised new tactics to flush out anti-tank nests. Leadership in the field adapted faster than German command could respond. While Hitler ordered his panzers to hold ground, American officers focused on flexibility. Break contact, flank, strike again. The result was a battlefield dynamic that turned the Sherman from underdog to unstoppable engine of maneuver. In this doctrine, every Sherman was a cog in a greater machine. Alone, it could lose. Together, they could not be stopped. The enemy angle, the shock of realization. At first, German tank crews couldn't believe what they were seeing. Reports from Normandy described endless waves of Allied armor. For every Sherman destroyed, another appeared. For every Panzer victory, the sky filled with thunderbolts and typhoons strafing the survivors. The Wehrmacht's Panzer Lehr Division, once elite, was shredded within weeks. SS Panzer units struggled to maintain even a fraction of their original strength. Their heavy tanks, once the terror of Europe, were breaking down faster than they could be replaced. German diaries from June and July 1944 reveal the psychological collapse behind the front lines. A Tiger gunner wrote, "We kill them, and they come back. Always more of them. Always." They realized that the Americans weren't fighting a traditional armored war. They were waging a war of systems, logistics, air power, and mobility. The Sherman was simply the most visible expression of that system. Even when German gunners scored perfect shots, their victories felt hollow. The wreckage of a Sherman meant nothing if, by evening, a new platoon had arrived to replace it. German field commanders, once proud of their technical superiority, began to question their own doctrine. The battlefield had changed. Perfection was collapsing under the weight of mass production. The enemy who had laughed at the toy tank was now drowning beneath its numbers. By mid-July, the German High Command no longer mocked the Sherman. They feared it, not for its armor or gun, but for what it represented. A nation that could replace in weeks what Germany could not rebuild in months. The laughter that once echoed through German war rooms had turned into silence. The toy tank was now the symbol of an unstoppable tide, and soon, that tide would break through the hedgerows of Normandy, in a storm of fire and steel that would decide the fate of Western Europe. By late July 1944, the battlefields of Normandy had become a maze of death. For nearly 2 months, the Allies had clawed through the hedgerow country, a suffocating landscape of thick earthen banks, narrow lanes, and ambush-filled fields. Every advance cost blood. Every field was a fortress. American tanks, trapped in this claustrophobic terrain, could barely see 50 yards ahead. German Panzerfaust teams hidden behind every bend struck without warning. The Sherman's mobility, its greatest advantage, was strangled by the bocage. But in late July, the weather cleared, and with it came Operation Cobra, the boldest American offensive yet. The plan was simple but devastating. Unleash a massive aerial bombardment to shatter German lines south of St. Lo, then send in fast-moving armored divisions, led by Shermans, to rip open the front and pour through the gap. At dawn on July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy darkened. More than 1 out of 500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force appeared overhead, B-17s and B-24s in tight formation. The sound was like thunder that never ended. Below them, German soldiers of the Panzer Lehr Division huddled in trenches, deafened and terrified. When the bombs fell, entire companies vanished. Trees turned to splinters. Tanks were flipped upside down by the shockwaves. Even the Americans watching from their lines were stunned. The earth shook beneath their boots as a carpet of explosions rolled across the horizon. When the smoke cleared, what had been a German defensive line was now a wasteland of craters and corpses. It was time for the Shermans to move. The 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, alongside infantry units of the 7th Corps, surged forward. Columns of Shermans roared across the shattered fields, their tracks grinding through the rubble. Tank Commander Sergeant Lafayette Poole, known as the Ace of Aces, led from the front. In just weeks, his crew would destroy 258 enemy vehicles, more than any other Allied tank commander. Poole's tank, in the mood, cut through German lines like a blade, gunning down anti-tank nests, outrunning ambushes, and leaving trails of burning half-tracks behind. The German survivors tried to regroup, but their radio lines were in chaos. Their units were shattered, their armor scattered, and their commanders dead or missing. Shermans advanced relentlessly, not cautiously, not hesitantly, but like a rising tide. When one tank was hit, another pushed forward. When German guns fired, Allied fighter bombers screamed down from above. The coordination between land and air was unlike anything the Germans had ever faced. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed convoys. Typhoons launched rockets into retreating panzer columns. The battlefield became a one-sided storm, a demonstration of what industrial warfare truly meant. In one village after another, Marigny, Coutances, Avranches, the Germans were overwhelmed. Their Tigers, low on fuel and ammunition, could only fight delaying actions before being abandoned or destroyed. The Sherman, mocked for its thin armor, was now everywhere, a moving wall of steel that advanced faster than the enemy could comprehend. By July 29th, the once proud Panzer Lehr Division was annihilated. Of its 200 tanks, barely a handful remained. Thousands of men were dead, wounded, or captured. General Fritz Bayerlein, its commander, later admitted that his division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The German army, long accustomed to holding the line in France, was now in full retreat. And behind the smoke and fire, the Sherman was the relentless heart of the Allied advance. Its engines roared through the French countryside, dust rising behind columns that stretched for miles. The laughter that had once filled German barracks at the sight of the American toy tank had turned into disbelief and despair. Wherever they looked, over the hedgerows, down the country roads, across the bombed fields, the same image met their eyes. Shermans, advancing, endless, unstoppable. The breakthrough at St. Lo was more than a tactical success. It was the moment the balance of power in Western Europe shifted forever. The Germans had built their reputation on armored dominance. But in those burning fields of Normandy, they learned a new truth. Quantity, when combined with quality, coordination, and courage, could crush even the most fearsome machines of war. And as the Sherman spearheaded the breakout toward Avranches, the road to Paris and the liberation of France finally opened. The pursuit begins. Once the American lines broke through south of St. Lo, there was no stopping them. German command posts were in chaos. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's radio orders went unanswered, his armored divisions scattered or destroyed. The Wehrmacht had lost control of Normandy. By early August 1944, General Omar Bradley's forces poured through the Avranches Gap, and the open countryside of France beckoned, terrain perfect for mobility and maneuver. This was where the Sherman truly came alive. On open ground, the M4's advantages, speed, mechanical reliability, and numbers, finally combined into a weapon of momentum. While German Panthers were superior in a duel, they broke down often, drank fuel like fire, and moved at a crawl. The Shermans, by contrast, ran endlessly. Crews could refuel and repair them in hours. Mechanics had spare parts ready in every field workshop. The U.S. Army's doctrine of keep moving forward became the battle's heartbeat. The encirclement at Falaise. As the Americans raced eastward, the British and Canadians pressed from the north. Between them lay the German 7th Army, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles trapped in a tightening noose near the small town of Falaise. The German High Command understood what was coming. If they didn't escape now, the entire Western Front could collapse. But Allied speed left no room to breathe. American and Polish armored units, their Shermans kicking up clouds of dust, raced toward Chambois to seal the gap. Every road was choked with retreating German convoys, horse-drawn wagons, trucks, and tanks all crammed together, desperate to flee. Then the skies opened again. Allied fighter bombers swooped in, strafing and rocketing the columns with devastating precision. The valley filled with flames, black smoke, and wrecked vehicles. German soldiers fled into the fields only to find the ground trembling beneath the approach of Sherman treads. In the villages surrounding Falaise, brutal close-range fighting erupted. Shermans traded fire with Panzer IVs at point-blank distance, their shells ricocheting off stone walls and burning through hedgerows. The Polish 1st Armored Division held its ground on Hill 262, blocking the last German escape route. By August 21, 1944, the trap slammed shut. The Falaise pocket was sealed. Inside it, more than 50,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The once mighty 5th Panzer Army was shattered. Corpses, destroyed vehicles, and twisted guns littered the countryside for miles, a grim reminder of what Allied firepower and coordination could do. The road to liberation. In the days that followed, the Allied advance turned into a flood. Sherman columns rolled through liberated towns, Alençon, Argentan, Chartres, their white stars cheered by crowds waving flags and flowers. By August 25th, the tanks of General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, supported by U.S. Shermans, entered Paris. The city that had suffered 4 years under Nazi rule erupted in joy. From the beaches of Normandy to the heart of France, the Shermans had been the constant companions of liberation. They had crossed hedgerows, fields, rivers, and ruins, sometimes burning, sometimes broken, but always advancing. And now the German army, once feared across Europe, was retreating toward its own borders. The shift in perception. The Germans who had once scoffed at the M4 now knew better. Captured reports from German officers revealed a profound change in tone. The enemy's tanks appear everywhere, one Wehrmacht captain wrote in late August. We destroy one, 3 take its place. We fall back and they are already behind us. The Sherman was no longer dismissed as a toy. It was a symbol of unstoppable Allied logistics, a tank that could be built faster than the enemy could destroy it. For every Panther that rolled out of a German factory, 6 Shermans were waiting on the docks of England. For every Tiger that broke down on the road, another American crew was firing from a fresh M4 in France. Even the Luftwaffe pilots flying above the chaos began to recognize the pattern. No matter how many tanks they spotted burning, more kept coming. A steel tide that refused to ebb. A new kind of victory. By the end of August, the German front in France had collapsed completely. The remnants of the Wehrmacht were streaming east toward the Seine River, hunted by advancing Allied armor. Sherman battalions crossed bridges under fire, their engines echoing through the night. Infantry rode on their hulls, exhausted but elated. The Allies had not just broken through Normandy, they had shattered the myth of German invincibility. For years, the Wehrmacht had been the master of mechanized warfare. Now, its best divisions lay buried in the dust of France, crushed beneath the machine it had once ridiculed. And as the Sherman columns rolled toward the German frontier, one truth became clear. The war in Western Europe had entered a new phase, one in which momentum, production, and relentless pursuit would decide the outcome. The laughter that began on the beaches of Normandy had long faded into silence. Only the steady growl of Sherman engines remained, rolling eastward toward the Rhine and the final reckoning. The dust of Normandy had barely settled when the scale of what had happened became clear. For the German army, the defeat was not just tactical. It was psychological, industrial, and moral. For the Allies, it was proof that the machine they had built, refined and doubted so many times before, the M4 Sherman, had delivered exactly what was promised: victory through endurance. In the aftermath of the Normandy campaign, Allied commanders took stock. Between June and August 1944, American forces had landed over 15,000 Sherman tanks on European soil. They had lost thousands to mines, anti-tank guns, and enemy armor, but for every one destroyed, 2 more rolled ashore. Replacement was no longer a luxury. It was a rhythm. This sheer capacity to sustain momentum stunned the Germans. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies as weak, decadent, and technically inferior. But now the smoking wrecks of Panther and Tiger tanks across northern France told a different story. One written not in theory but in steel and fire. The Allies had mastered something the Germans never truly grasped: that a war of machines was also a war of logistics, fuel, and time. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was reeling. Every engagement against the Americans was becoming a war of attrition, one they could not win. German tank crews might destroy 5 Shermans in a single fight, but within days replacements filled the gap. And behind them came supply lines, fuel trucks, mobile repair depots, and endless convoys of spare parts. The United States had turned warfare into an assembly line. Factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago ran day and night, churning out more tanks, engines, and ammunition than Germany could hope to match. This was the heart of Allied power, the arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin Roosevelt had called it. It wasn't just about firepower. It was about the ability to maintain that firepower indefinitely. German officers in their post-war reports admitted that the Sherman's presence on the battlefield had a demoralizing effect. It wasn't the fear of a single tank. It was the sight of endless columns appearing again and again, after every battle, after every defeat. The psychological weight of facing a force that never stopped growing broke even the most hardened Panzer veterans. Normandy had also rewritten the book on how armored warfare was fought. The early war years had been defined by the German blitzkrieg, fast, daring thrusts across open country. Now, in a reversal of fate, it was the Allied armies using those very tactics, propelled by Sherman divisions that refused to slow down. In the weeks after the Falaise Pocket, American armored columns were advancing over 100 miles in a single week, an unimaginable pace just months earlier. Towns that had once been deep inside German-controlled France fell in a matter of hours. The Sherman, though never the strongest or the thickest armored, had become the perfect instrument for this new kind of war, one built on coordination, communication, and adaptability. Radio systems linked tank commanders directly to aircraft and artillery units, allowing for real-time support. When German ambushes struck, the response was immediate. Artillery barrages, airstrikes, and fresh tanks rolling in within minutes. For the first time since 1939, it was the Allies dictating the tempo of war, and as the wreckage of Normandy smoldered behind them, one truth spread quietly among the German ranks, whispered in disbelief. They win not because their tanks are better, one captured panzer commander said, but because they never stop coming. That realization marked the end of German confidence and the beginning of the Allied advance toward the heart of Europe. After the smoke of Normandy cleared, the Allied High Command recognized something profound. The success of the Sherman was not an accident. It was the visible proof that industrial strength, adaptability, and doctrine could overcome even the most technically advanced enemy. Normandy had been the crucible. Now the lessons learned there would shape the rest of the campaign across Western Europe. American generals like Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, and Courtney Hodges adjusted their strategies accordingly. Instead of head-on assaults against entrenched German armor, they began exploiting the Sherman's greatest advantages: speed, coordination, and reliability. Armored divisions were reorganized into highly mobile strike forces. Infantry, engineers, artillery, and tanks moved as one body, a living organism of mechanized warfare. The Sherman was the bloodstream that kept it alive. When fuel shortages hit the German army, Allied tankers pressed forward. When bridges were blown, engineers built new ones overnight. And when German counterattacks came, as they would in the Ardennes just months later, the Shermans met them with disciplined, cohesive defense. The battlefield of Europe had changed. The Blitzkrieg was no longer German. It wore a white star. Yet behind the triumph there was a price. Tens of thousands of Sherman crewmen never made it home. Inside those metal hulls, the war was brutal and intimate, fought at close range with seconds to live or die. The Sherman's armor, while adequate against most German guns, could not withstand hits from the dreaded 88mm. Crews called their tanks Ronsons, after the lighter brand that lights every time. In letters and diaries, soldiers wrote not only of fear but of pride. Pride in their machine and their comrades, and in their relentless push forward. Many who survived spoke later of the Sherman not as a weapon, but as a companion. It was the machine that carried them from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. And though the war was far from over in 1944, the victory in France had already set the tone for what came next. A long, grinding march toward the Rhine, with the M4 always at the front. The German High Command, meanwhile, was coming to terms with a devastating truth. Their obsession with technological perfection, the massive Tigers, the sophisticated Panthers, had been their undoing. Each of their tanks required precious metals, weeks of production and specialized maintenance. Every breakdown meant hours lost, and every destroyed Tiger meant irreplaceable materials gone forever. By contrast, the Allies had embraced practicality. The Sherman wasn't perfect, and it was enough. And in modern warfare, enough meant victory. Captured German reports from late 1944 admitted as much. One field officer wrote bitterly that, "For every tank we destroy, they build 10 more. For every bridge we bomb, they build 3. They are not men, and they are a machine." It was the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht's armored legend. By the time the Allies reached the borders of Germany, the M4 Sherman had become more than a tank. It was a symbol of American ingenuity, Allied unity, and industrial determination. Factories in the U.S. continued to produce upgraded versions. The Sherman Firefly, fitted with a British 17-pounder gun, now capable of killing even a Tiger. The M4A3E8 Easy 8, faster and deadlier than ever. And the Calliope, mounting a barrage of rockets on its turret, a mobile storm of fire. Together, they represented evolution through necessity, proof that adaptability, not arrogance, defined modern warfare. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in 1945, Shermans led the way once more. The machine that had once been laughed at was now rolling through the heart of the Reich itself. Normandy had proven the Sherman's worth, but its true legacy lay beyond. In every tank that followed, in every doctrine built upon its lessons, and in every soldier who trusted that a simple, reliable machine could change the course of history. The war was not yet over, but the outcome had already been decided by a tank that refused to stop. The war in Europe would rage on for many more months, through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, across the Rhine, and into the shattered heart of Germany itself. But the spirit of victory had already been forged in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Sherman was never meant to be a monument. It was meant to be a tool, a machine built by ordinary men for ordinary soldiers to do an extraordinary job. It wasn't the fastest, nor the strongest, nor the thickest armored, but it was the most human. It reflected everything that defined the Allied war effort: teamwork, adaptability, and endurance. When a Sherman broke down, a mechanic fixed it. When one burned, another took its place. When one crew was lost, a new one climbed in. Not out of glory, but out of duty. And in that relentless cycle, something remarkable happened. The machine became more than the sum of its parts. It became the embodiment of an idea, that war at its core is not won by fear or perfection, but by persistence. The Germans had laughed at America's toy tanks. They had trusted in the power of steel and precision, in the invincibility of armor. But in the end, it was the will to endure, multiplied by the power of industry and belief that crushed their defenses in Normandy and carried the Allies to victory. The story of the Sherman is not just the story of a tank. It's the story of a generation that refused to break, a reminder that even in the darkest days of war, courage and cooperation can move mountains of steel and history alike. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, tens of thousands of Shermans stood quiet across Europe, some burned out, some resting in fields of wildflowers. They had done their part, and as the world rebuilt from the ruins, one lesson remained. Sometimes the simplest machine, built with purpose, driven by courage, can change the fate of a continent.